I thought I'd start out this evening by just going through some of the questions that I've received. The one I thought I'd start with is one that's sort of very universal. I find people have their own anxieties, their own worries, their own fears about the state of the world. And so I thought I'd start with this particular email, and this is from Jack. And Jack writes, "Hi, Adya. How do I fit this world with any sense of peace? Capitalism wages war across the world, misery and suffering raining down on the already poor and dispossessed. Even at home, it is the poorest who suffer most, and there is no end in sight, only ever more repression. Yet I have to eat, and a roof is preferable to sleeping under a newspaper. But to have these things, I must comply with the structural order and pay taxes wherever it is applied. Over half the federal budget is spent on the military, so inevitably I contribute to the slaughter of innocents for the sake of my life. Please, Adya, tell me, how do I find peace in this world, knowing my own complicity? The cost of living seems just too high. With love, Jack." I think that Jack puts in a sort of a very concise way a lot of the fears that a lot of people have. They can be, everyone has their own fears about their world, has their own particular political points of view and points of view on the state of the world, the environment, government, all the rest. But right now, I think, as everybody knows, there's just a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and an immense amount of anger over the state of the world on many, many, many different fronts. And so I get asked about these kind of questions quite a bit, how to respond. This one, I think, is a little more... This email is a little more intimate than most, because what Jack is really referring to is the question is in the very first sentence: how do I fit in this world with any sense of peace? So to experience peace is in one sense you could say, a very personal thing, certainly a very personal desire. And our minds are seemingly so conditioned to constantly be coming up with reasons why, number one, we can't be at peace, and number two, why even sometimes we shouldn't be at peace. Like, how could you dare be at peace? Look at the state of the world. Look at the state of human suffering, and not only human suffering, but just the suffering of all beings. And yet I think this is a very, very, very important part. It is very easy for our minds to get caught up in, as Jack says, the state of the world, however we see that to be, and from whatever point of view we look at that. And without denying the state of the world, without denying the tremendous amount of hate, ignorance, greed, fear, war, starvation, all the rest, without denying any of that, I think it's also important to see that it is what our minds do with that information, what our minds do with what we see on TV or read in the newspapers or see in our own communities. It's what our minds do with that information that pulls one away from any sense of peace. Often we think that the reason we can't be at peace, the reason we can't feel free or open, is because of some exterior circumstance. The mind would say, I can't be at peace. Look at the world. Look at the terrible suffering. Maybe even people very close to you. Maybe yourself. How dare I be at peace with all this catastrophe, as so many people see it? And yet, it's so important to see that not being at peace will not contribute anything useful to the world around us. To be moved by agitation, fear, anger, upset, resistance. None of this helps anybody. These sort of negative mind states that the mind can create, given what it sees, what it experiences. These negative mind states are, in a certain sense, they are one of the catastrophes of the human world. Is that even when people look around and they may feel some compassion, some deep love, some deep upwelling of a call to a true response, to a way to participate in a way that's engaged and yet helpful and compassionate, and in a way that doesn't cause yet more and more and more division. This can be very difficult, people, because our minds are so used to looking at a difficult situation and creating division out of it. We see suffering, we see inequality, we see, so much of the difficulty of the world, and it's easy for our minds to create a sort of conflict, an internal conflict, a division. Us and them, me and them, the right ones and the wrong ones, the lovers and the haters, and the mind sort of creates all this. Or the mind simply sits back and observes it and goes, how could I be at peace? How could one actually be at peace when there's so much suffering, so much catastrophe in the world? This really speaks to the necessity, a really vital necessity, a necessity that is very, very, very important at the present time, to begin to really deeply see, how does seeing the world and all that it is, how does seeing that take away one's peace? And is that what takes away your peace? Is that what makes one anxious or angry, upset? Or is what makes you anxious and upset what your mind makes out of it? The way the mind goes into division against hate, against ignorance, against greed, against starvation. Again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying in any way that we should not see the world and some of the difficulty and strife and sorrow that is contained within this world. And so much of it we seem to be contributing to, us human beings. But it's also important to see that it's so often it's our minds which creates the division. How can I live in this world and be at peace? The answer is easy. Don't go into division over it. Yes, but how can I not be divided in a world that has so much anger, so much upset, so much hatred, so much misuse of power, and all the rest? How could I? How could I exist in that world and still be at peace? Well, you have to look very deeply. What is it that creates the agitation, the anxiety, the anger, the upset? Is it actually what's happening? Or is it how your mind interprets what's happening? And do you think that being upset, being anxious, going into fear, do you actually think that that helps anybody? Is that part of your compassionate contribution to humanity? You see, it's very important to see that even though that I understand why people get so upset with the state of the world when they look around themselves. I understand that. I understand how people look at the world, look at the hate, ignorance, greed, corruption, all the rest, and can easily go into some sort of overwhelming feeling of upset. It's easy to do. But it's very, very important to see that going into that state of sort of emotional overwhelm is literally caused by what your mind does with what it sees. In other words, it's the story you tell yourself. If you tell yourself a terrible nightmarish story, then you'll have terrible nightmarish experiences. I'm not suggesting you tell yourself a good story either. I'm not suggesting you whitewash the way things are and tell yourself a nice spiritual story. This isn't about going from one sort of story to the other story, but actually perceiving things as they are. Can we see even the inequities of life without our story about the inequities? And what comes within us? What happens within us when we stop being divided in ourselves against the world? When we stop saying, no, 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 no. This can't be, that can't be, you shouldn't be, this shouldn't be. Many times I think human beings are afraid to let go of their negative relationship with the strife of the world, thinking almost in an unconscious way that if I let go of my resistance to all that, then I would just sit back and I would do nothing. I've had a lot of people, when I've talked to them about this, before they've really fully understood what I'm saying, say, well, are you saying that we should just do nothing then? That we should just let the whole world be as it is and just, have no participation? And of course, that's not what I'm saying at all. I can understand how people think that's what I'm saying sometimes. Because the point I'm making is something can be quite subtle, because it's not an either-or thing. That's not where it comes from. First, we have to see that the way we feel about the world is being created not by the world, not by what's going on out there, but by what we tell ourselves about it. And what we tell ourselves about the world is never the way it actually is. The story we tell about something, about anything, is never as real as the thing itself. So the story that you could tell yourself about starvation, inequity, the abuse of power, all that, the story you could tell yourself about it is not more real than the thing itself. Yes, there is great inequity, there is great abuse, there is great sorrow. But can we actually open up enough to take all that in as it is, simply as it is, without resistance, without going into division? You see, because only when we can do that can we come up with a response. It's not about having your sense of peace with the world just so you can have a sense of peace. I'm not talking about something that's personal in any way. This isn't so that you can have peace with what's going on. That's sort of incidental, whether one's at peace with the world or not. But when we're truly undivided, no matter what we see, when our mind no longer can convince us of the story that creates a sense of division, then quite naturally we will not just hold on to a sort of sense of peace, because that would be its own sort of division, trying to hide in a cocoon of sort of an inner experience. But actually, when we come to that state of non-division, then we can find a creative response, our own unique response to situations all around us. Then we can be a conscious and creative and compassionate contributor to what you might think of as the good. And I'm using the word good as something that's beyond good and bad. We don't have words that actually encompass something that's beyond dualistic language, but it's the good beyond good, so that we can be a natural force for goodness.